Have you ever walked into a woodworking store? You see all these amazing tools and jigs. They promise perfect cuts and flawless projects. Then you look at the price tag. Ouch. Suddenly, your wallet feels a lot lighter. I was recently looking for a good tapering jig. For making those cool-looking table legs that get thinner at the bottom. I found some really nice ones online. They were made of shiny aluminum and had all sorts of fancy knobs and rulers, but they also had a price tag that was close to $500. $500 for a tool that helps you cut wood at a slight angle. That just seemed crazy to me. I believe woodworking should be for everyone. It shouldn't be a hobby only for people with deep pockets. The high cost of some of these commercial jigs can really discourage beginners. It makes you feel like you can't create amazing things without spending a fortune. I knew there had to be a better way. A cheaper way. Woodworking is about creativity and problem solving, right? So, I decided to solve this problem myself. I set a challenge. Build a high-quality tapering jig for $0. The only rule was that I could only use materials I found for free. It was time to turn some trash into a woodworking treasure. This wasn't just about saving money though, it was about proving a point. You don't need the fanciest gear to make great things. Some of the best tools are the ones you make yourself in your own shop. They are customized to your needs, and you understand exactly how they work. My goal was to create something that could perform just as well as, if not better than, those expensive store-bought versions. I wanted a jig that was accurate, repeatable, and easy to use. It seemed like a tall order, especially when your building materials are destined for the landfill. But I was excited to see what I could come up with. So, the mission was clear. Build a fully functional, precise tapering jig without spending a single penny. It would need to hold a workpiece securely. It would need to be adjustable, and, most importantly, it would need to guide my saw for a perfectly straight cut, every single time. The journey began not in a hardware store, but next to a dumpster. It was time to go on a treasure hunt. You'd be surprised what people throw away. What one person sees as garbage, a woodworker can often see as a project waiting to happen. The hunt was on for the perfect pieces to build my $500 jig for free. My search for materials started right in my neighborhood on bulk trash day. It's like a free-for-all for makers and builders. My first find was a big win. Someone had thrown out an old piece of 3/4-inch plywood. It was a bit scuffed up and had some paint on it, but it was flat and solid. This would be perfect for the base of my jig, the main sled that would slide along my table saw fence. I needed a smooth, stable foundation, and this piece of plywood was more than up to the task. I loaded it into my truck, feeling like I had just struck gold. The most important part of the jig was now secured. Next, I needed some sort of rails for the adjustable part of the jig to slide on. I was looking for something metal and straight. As I drove down the street, I spotted a discarded office chair sitting by the curb. These chairs are a goldmine of parts. I looked underneath and found exactly what I was hoping for. The mechanism that allows the chair to slide back and forth was mounted on two sturdy steel rails. They were straight, strong, and even had a smooth sliding action. Perfect. I also grabbed the lever and locking mechanism from the chair. I figured I could use that to lock my jig at a specific angle. Now I needed some smaller pieces. I needed a fence to hold the wood I'd be cutting. As luck would have it, a neighbor was getting rid of some old home decor. Leaning against their trash can was a large, ugly picture frame. The frame itself was made of a nice, straight piece of hardwood. It was probably oak or maple. I knew that once I removed the ugly gold paint and cut it down, it would make a fantastic, rigid fence for my jig. A good fence needs to be perfectly straight to ensure an accurate cut, and this piece of wood was ideal. It was much better than using a piece of plywood, which could have some flex. The final pieces of the puzzle were the small bits and pieces. The hardware, screws, knobs, and bolts can add up in cost if you have to buy them new. Remember that office chair? It was full of them. I spent about 10 minutes taking it apart, and ended up with a whole jar of various screws, bolts, and washers. I now had everything I needed: a plywood base, steel rails and a locking mechanism from a chair, a hardwood fence from a picture frame, and all the screws to put it together. The total cost was still a big, fat zero. Now it was time to head back to the shop and turn this pile of junk into a precision tool. Back in the workshop, I laid out all my treasures on the workbench. It was time to bring this vision to life. The first step was creating the base. I cut the large piece of plywood into two main parts. One would be the sled that runs against the table saw fence. The other piece would be the adjustable part that holds the wood. I made sure my cuts were perfectly square. A jig is only as accurate as you build it, so I took my time with every step. I sanded the edges of the plywood to make them smooth, which would help the sled glide easily along the fence of my table saw. Next, I worked on the sliding mechanism. I took apart the chair mechanism to get the two steel rails. I carefully mounted these rails onto the main plywood base. I had to make sure they were perfectly parallel to each other. If they weren't, the jig would bind up and not slide smoothly. I used a combination square and a lot of patience, measuring multiple times before drilling any holes. Once the rails were securely screwed down, I attached the other part of the sliding mechanism to the second piece of plywood. This top piece would now slide smoothly back and forth over the base. Now it was time to add the fence. I took the old picture frame and stripped off the gold paint. Underneath was that beautiful, straight hardwood I was hoping for. I cut it to the length of my sliding plywood piece. I attached it to the top piece, using strong wood glue and several screws from my jar of salvaged hardware. This fence needed to be perfectly square to the base so that it would hold the workpiece correctly. I used my best square and clamps to hold it in place while the glue dried, ensuring a rock-solid and accurate connection. This fence is what the wood being cut would press against. The final step was adding the locking system and a handle. I used the lever and locking plate from the old office chair. I figured out a way to mount it so that when I pushed the lever, it would press a block of wood against the sliding part, locking it firmly in place. This would allow me to set a specific angle and not have to worry about it slipping during a cut. For a handle, I just used a chunky offcut of wood from my scrap bin, sanded it smooth, and attached it to the back of the sled. The jig was complete. It looked a bit strange, a Frankenstein's monster of a tool, but it felt solid and the action was smooth. With the jig fully assembled, it was time for the most important part: testing. A jig can look great, but if it doesn't cut accurately, it's just a fancy-looking piece of firewood. The first test was for a simple taper cut. I wanted to make a table leg. I grabbed a scrap piece of a 2x4, marked a gentle taper on it, and set the jig to match my line. I clamped the wood securely against my new hardwood fence. I was a little nervous as I turned on the table saw. I took a deep breath, placed the jig against the saw's fence, and slowly pushed it through the blade. The result? It was perfect. The cut was incredibly smooth and arrow straight. There was no burning or blade marks. The jig slid along the fence without any wobble or hesitation. I measured the finished piece, and the taper was exactly what I had marked out. It was a success. I was genuinely surprised at how well it worked on the very first try. This pile of trash I had assembled was performing like a high-end piece of equipment. I couldn't help but smile. My $0 jig was already proving its worth against the expensive commercial versions I had seen online, but one good cut isn't enough. A good jig needs to be repeatable. It needs to make the exact same cut over and over again. So, I grabbed 3 more pieces of 2x4, and without changing the jig setting, I ran each one through the saw. I lined them up on my workbench, and they were identical. The angles were perfect matches. This was the true test of a quality jig. The locking mechanism I salvaged from the office chair was holding strong, preventing any slipping. The accuracy was just as good as any $500 jig you could buy. In fact, because the base was so wide and stable, it felt even safer to use. This project was about more than just building a tool. It was a lesson in resourcefulness. It proved that you don't need to spend a lot of money to have a capable and well-equipped workshop. With a little bit of creativity and a willingness to look at trash differently, you can build tools that are just as good, if not better, than the store-bought ones. So next time you see a high price tag on a tool, don't get discouraged. Look in your scrap bin, check the curb on trash day, and think about how you can build it yourself. You'll save a ton of money, and you'll end up with a tool that you can be truly proud of.